He was walking his sheepdog along an old path when he noticed a boat that no one knew about. What was hidden under the water changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The forest had always been both a refuge and a reminder. David walked along the ridge trail with the deliberate pace of a man who knew how to measure his steps. The path was half swallowed by moss and thyme, the air heavy with the scent of pine needles and wet bark. His boots pressed into the soft earth, leaving no trace behind. 10 years had passed since he'd last worn the green uniform of the Forest Service, but some habits refused to fade. He still scanned the tree line for movement, still noticed every broken branch, still listened for the faintest rustle beyond the wind. Ray walked a few paces ahead, her black coat glistening with moisture. The German shepherd moved silently, muscles rippling under the short fur, every motion cautious and efficient. She stopped often, sniffing the air, then looked back at him, as if to ask whether they were truly supposed to be here. David gave a small nod, more to himself than to her. He had stopped talking aloud years ago. Out here, silence had a different kind of honesty. The late autumn sky was a smear of gray and dull amber. The sun had already dropped behind the ridges, and the forest was sinking into its own shadow. It was the season he liked best, the time when the woods grew thin, the colors muted, and the world seemed honest about its decay. He carried a small pack, just enough for 3 days, a blanket roll, a small gas stove, dried food, and a single metal mug clipped to the side. He kept his old ranger's knife at his belt, polished from years of use, and a worn, leather-bound field journal that had long ago replaced any need for company. He had left everything behind after the storm. They called it an accident in the reports. A patrol boat capsized on Mason Lake during a thunderstorm. One man drowned. The other survived. David had survived. He never corrected anyone's version of events. He let the story grow cold and quiet, the way all unfinished things do. But no matter how far he walked, no matter how many trails he crossed, the lake waited in the back of his mind, a mirror that refused to dry. The trail narrowed and curved down toward a valley. He could see through the bare trees the faint outline of what used to be Station 12, a wooden lookout post, perched on a slope above the lake basin. The roof had collapsed years ago, and the walls leaned as if tired of holding themselves up. That had been his first post when he was 26, freshly sworn in, proud and naive enough to think nature could be managed by paperwork and radios. He remembered nights when he and his partner, Clive, would sit by the shortwave receiver, listening to bursts of static, tracing the voices of other patrols across the vast quiet of the forest. Now, approaching that same place, he felt the air thicken with memory. He stopped and drew a slow breath, the kind that hurt more than it healed. Ray brushed against his leg, pressing close for a moment before trotting ahead again. Her presence steadied him. She didn't know his past, didn't judge it. Dogs only ever saw who you were in the moment. By the time they reached the clearing, twilight had deepened into a blue-gray stillness. The tower's steps had rotted away, leaving only a skeleton of wood and iron. He circled it, feeling the crunch of old glass under his boots. Inside the small cabin, the smell of mildew and ash mingled with the faint sweetness of decaying pine. A warped map still clung to one wall. The ink faded into ghostly rivers and lines. His flashlight beam drifted across an old wooden crate, stenciled with the faded letters, U.S. Forest Service. He traced them with his glove, and for a moment, he saw his own hands years ago. Younger, steadier, holding a radio microphone and calling out coordinates over the sound of thunder. He sat down on the floorboards. The wood was cold beneath him. The walls creaked softly in the wind. For a long time, he just listened to the ticking of cooling metal, to the faint drip of water somewhere in the dark, to Ray's breathing outside the doorway. The past lived here in the silence, more vivid than anywhere else. He took out his field journal and wrote a date at the top of a new page. He had stopped numbering the days years ago, but this one felt like it needed to be marked. Beneath it, he wrote 2 words: back north. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, 10 years. That night, he camped beside the tower. He built a small fire from deadfall and boiled water for tea, the steam curling in the cold air. Ray lay beside him, her head resting on her paws, eyes half closed but alert. The firelight flickered across her fur. He watched the sparks drift upward and vanish into the dark. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once, low and hollow, and then the forest settled again. He thought about Clive, the last conversation they'd had before the storm rolled in. They had argued over protocol, over whether to check the northern inlet despite the warning of high winds. Clive had gone anyway. David had stayed back at the station, checking instruments, waiting for a signal that never came. When they found the body 3 days later, the patrol boat was gone. The lake gave nothing back. He lay awake long after the fire died down, staring up through the gaps in the trees. The sky was the color of slate, and the first thin snowflakes drifted down, melting as they touched his jacket. He felt the weight of 10 winters pressing against him. Sleep came late, shallow and uneasy. The last sound he heard was the wind moving through the dead branches, a sound like water against metal. When morning came, the world was silver and quiet. The frost clung to the grass, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. David packed his things slowly, tightening the straps on his pack, making sure the campsite looked untouched. He followed the narrow trail that sloped down toward the lake, moving through mist that thickened with each step. Ray trotted ahead, pausing now and then to look back, her breath visible in short bursts of white. The descent was steep. The ground turned soft under his boots, and soon the smell of wet reeds and algae replaced the scent of pine. The mist began to thin near the water's edge. Mason Lake spread before him, a gray mirror surrounded by black trees. He hadn't seen it since that day. The surface was calm, unbroken, too calm for November. Not even a ripple moved across it. It looked less like water and more like glass. He stopped at the shoreline. Ray sat beside him, silent. The lake reflected the pale sky and the outlines of dead trees leaning over it. A few yellow leaves floated near the shallows, their colors muted, their edges eaten away. For a long time he just stood there, the cold seeping through his boots. He could almost hear the radio static again, the call sign, the clipped voice lost in wind. Then something caught his eye. A shape in the distance, half hidden by the morning fog. At first he thought it was a fallen log, but as the mist shifted, the shape took on lines, angles, a faint gleam of metal. It was a boat. A small aluminum rowboat, rusted and tilting to one side, stuck in the reeds near the center of the lake. He stared for a long time without moving. His throat felt dry, his heartbeat slow and heavy. The boat was too far to make out details, but even from here he could tell it wasn't new. The hull was streaked with rust, the oarlocks broken, the stern crushed inward as if struck by something. It could have been any boat, but something in him knew better. It shouldn't be there. Not after all these years. Not here, on this lake. Ray whined softly, sensing his unease. He reached down and rested a hand on her head. The metal of his ring finger was cold against her fur. The years fell away in that moment, the night of the storm, the searchlights sweeping across the black water, the shouting, the silence afterward. He could still smell the oil and rain. He took a step closer to the shore. The boat didn't move. The reflection of the sky trembled faintly around it. He imagined the weight of the years resting at the bottom of that hull, the secrets that water might have hidden all this time. For a moment he wanted to turn back, to walk away before memory swallowed him whole. But the stillness held him there. A gust of wind rippled across the lake, and the boat shifted slightly, the faint clang of metal echoing across the water. It sounded like a voice trying to rise from the deep. Ray barked once, sharp and uncertain. Then the wind died again, and the sound was gone. He stood there until the mist thickened once more, until the boat was swallowed again by gray. Only when the first drops of cold rain began to fall did he turn away. The trail back up the slope looked steeper than before, each step heavier, but he climbed slowly, his breath steady, the image of that boat fixed behind his eyes. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay beneath the tarp, listening to the rain patter against nylon, to Ray shifting restlessly beside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint outline of the boat. He remembered the last words Clive had said over the radio. North Inlet. Something's off here. The transmission had cut out seconds later. Now, 10 years later, the lake had returned what it had taken, or at least a part of it. Before dawn, he sat up and lit his stove. The hiss of the flame sounded too loud in the dark. He poured water into the tin mug and waited for it to boil, his hands wrapped around the handle for warmth. Outside, the forest was still and black. The rain had stopped. He took a slow sip, the bitterness grounding him. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would go back to the lake. He would find a way to reach that boat. He had avoided it for a decade. It would not be waiting forever. Ray lifted her head, ears pricked, eyes glinting in the dim light. Yeah, he murmured. We'll go. She rested her head again, content. The stove flickered out. Beyond the edge of the tarp, the first faint light of morning began to seep through the trees. The forest awoke with it, dripping, breathing, alive. And far below, the surface of Mason Lake waited, gray and silent, holding its secrets just beneath the calm. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving a damp silence that seemed to cling to every surface. The forest smelled of wet bark and iron, the kind of metallic tang that followed storms. David packed his gear deliberately, the motions automatic from years of habit. Ray stood nearby, tail low, eyes fixed on him, as though she knew something heavy was coming. When he finally tightened the last strap of his pack, he looked toward the faint gray veil of fog still rising from Mason Lake. The image of that tilted boat refused to fade from his mind. It felt less like something he had seen, and more like something that had been waiting for him to return. They made their way down the slope through the underbrush, the dew clinging to Ray's fur and darkening the cuffs of David's jacket. The air was cold enough that their breaths came out in pale clouds. Every few steps he glanced at the trees, half expecting to see movement. A deer, perhaps, or the flicker of another hiker. But the forest remained empty. The world here had shrunk to the sound of his own footsteps and the faint jingle of Ray's collar. When they reached the water's edge, the mist was lifting. The lake stretched before him like a mirror of steel, unbroken and still. Somewhere beneath that surface lay the memory of everything he had tried not to remember. The sight of the boat yesterday had stirred something old and sharp inside him, something that refused to let go. Today, he meant to see it up close. He began searching along the shoreline. Driftwood littered the mud, and a few old planks had washed up among the reeds. He gathered them together, testing each one for strength. It was a foolish plan. He knew it, but it was the only way. The cold water could kill him if he slipped, and the lake was deep even near the shallows. Still, he tied the boards together with a length of rope from his pack and used an old branch as a crossbeam. Ray circled him restlessly, whining when he stepped into the water to push the makeshift raft free. "Stay," he told her, his voice rough from disuse. She stopped but didn't lie down. Her ears pricked forward, tracking every movement as he climbed onto the raft. The boards dipped under his weight, but held. He pushed off, the oar creaking softly in the silence. The shore receded, Ray's dark shape growing smaller until she was just a patch of black against the gray line of trees. The water was colder than he expected. It soaked through the wood and numbed his fingers where they gripped the oar. The boat ahead came into focus slowly, its rusted sides mottled with algae, the color of dried blood. The closer he came, the stronger the smell stagnant water mixed with iron and decay. The hull was split open along one side, and a single oar floated beside it, bumping softly against the metal with the rhythm of the small waves his raft made. When he reached the boat, he steadied himself and leaned over the edge. The interior was half filled with dark water and mud, reeds tangled around the seats. And there, wedged against the inner wall, he saw a dull metallic shape, a box, square and heavy, with a faded insignia stamped on the lid. His heart stuttered once. The insignia was familiar, the same as the one stitched onto his old Ranger jacket, the same shape engraved on the badges they'd worn on their shoulders. He tried to lift the box, but it was wedged tight. He braced one knee against the rim of the boat and pulled until the rusted edges gave way with a screech that echoed across the water. The sound was strange and lonely, as if the lake itself had woken from sleep. For a moment, he thought the box might slip from his grasp, but he caught it against his chest and hauled it onto the raft. The weight nearly tipped him into the water. He sat still until the raft steadied again, breathing hard, feeling the ache in his arms. The box was sealed with a latch that had corroded almost to dust. He struck it with the handle of the oar until it cracked. Inside, the air smelled of oil and mildew. There were papers, soggy, half disintegrated, along with a small handheld radio, the old kind with a rubber antenna and a waterproof journal. The pages of the journal were swollen but still legible in places. The handwriting stopped him cold. He didn't need to see the signature to know it belonged to Clive. He stared at the first page, the ink blurred, but the words still fighting to survive. Shifted again tonight. Northern Bank. Trucks at midnight. Said not to ask questions. The next few pages described small things. Weather changes, wildlife sightings, the usual observations they'd once been required to log. But near the end, the tone changed. Water smells wrong. Strong chemical trace. They said it's runoff, but doesn't feel right. Told David not to worry. I don't think I can ignore this anymore. The last line was a single sentence written in jagged letters. If we don't make it, someone will find this. He felt the breath leave him. His throat tightened, as though the cold air itself had turned to glass. For years, he had believed Clive's death was an accident, an unpredictable storm, bad timing, nothing more. But this changed everything. He flipped through the remaining pages, searching for more, but the ink dissolved into gray stains. The radio inside the box was corroded beyond repair. At the bottom lay a small photograph in a plastic sleeve. The two of them, younger, standing beside the same patrol boat that now rusted in the water. Clive had been smiling. David had one hand on the boat's bow, his face half shadowed by the sun. He turned the photo over. On the back, in faint pencil, was a single word. North. He sat motionless for a long time, the raft drifting gently with the current. The world had gone quiet again, the kind of silence that wasn't peace but absence. The water lapped against the sides of the raft, steady and indifferent. Somewhere above, a hawk called once and vanished into the distance. David looked toward the northern end of the lake, where the trees grew darker and denser, hiding whatever roads or ruins might remain there. When he returned to shore, Ray met him at the edge, tail low, whining softly. He set the box down on the ground, his hands shaking from cold and fatigue. The raft drifted away, bumping against the reeds, until it caught on a rock. He opened the box again in the daylight, studying every scrap of paper he'd recovered, though most of it was unreadable. The journal he tucked carefully into his jacket pocket. For a while, he just sat there. The lake stretched behind him, deceptively calm. He thought about all the times he'd told himself that some things were better left buried. Maybe he had believed it because it was easier. But the truth had a way of staying afloat, no matter how much time passed. It waited for the right season, the right eyes, to rise again. Ray barked once, low and uncertain. David followed her gaze and froze. Along the muddy shore, a set of footprints curved toward the trees. Fresh ones, larger than his own, pressed deep into the soft earth. He knelt to examine them. Whoever made them had been there recently, maybe hours before. The prints led north along the waterline, vanishing into the undergrowth. There were no tire marks, no signs of a camp, just footprints, deliberate and solitary. He rose slowly, scanning the forest. The air was still. Then, faintly, he heard it. The distant hum of an engine, low and irregular, somewhere beyond the ridge. It faded almost as soon as he noticed it. He stood listening, but nothing followed. Ray's ears twitched, her body tense. "Easy," he said softly, though his own pulse had begun to quicken. He packed the contents of the box into his bag and slung it over his shoulder. The decision was already made, though he hadn't spoken it aloud. He needed to know what was hidden at the northern edge of the lake. Clive's last word, north, was more than a direction. It was a summons. The climb was hard, the trail almost gone, overgrown with thorn and moss. The sun hung low, casting long bars of light through the trees. The forest was quiet, except for the rhythmic crunch of his boots and Ray's steady breathing beside him. Now and then, he thought he saw movement in the distance, a shadow slipping between trunks. But when he looked again, there was nothing. The air grew colder as he climbed, the light thinning until only patches of gold broke through the branches. Halfway up, he stopped to rest beside a fallen log. He took out the photograph again. The younger version of himself looked like a stranger, someone who still believed that every duty had meaning. He wondered what Clive had thought in those last moments, out there on the lake, realizing what he'd stumbled upon. The thought pressed on him like weight. He folded the photo carefully and put it away. As the light began to fade, he reached the crest of the ridge. Beyond it lay a shallow valley where the trees thinned into open marshland. He recognized the landscape instantly. Years ago, this had been a restricted area, an old supply depot used for fuel storage during the fire seasons. The records had called it decommissioned. He had never questioned why. Now, standing there, he felt the air change. It carried a sour, chemical edge that stung the back of his throat. The reeds along the edge of the marsh were stained a sickly yellow. Their roots sunk into mud the color of ash. He crouched and touched the ground. The soil was damp and oily, sticking to his glove. He smelled gasoline or something close to it. The realization struck hard and fast. Whatever Clive had seen all those years ago, it had not been an accident. Someone had been dumping chemicals here, letting the runoff seep into the lake. The storm had merely covered the rest. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Behind him, Ray gave a soft growl, ears pricked. He turned, but there was only forest. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was holding its breath. He decided to make camp near the ridge rather than push farther in the dark. He gathered dry wood from beneath the pines and lit a small fire, careful to shield the flame from the wind. The warmth seeped into his hands, easing the ache. Ray lay beside him, head resting on her paws, eyes fixed on the trees. David opened the journal again, reading by firelight until the words blurred. Each entry was a thread pulling him deeper into the truth he had avoided for a decade. When he finally closed it, the night was thick around them. The wind moved through the reeds below, carrying the faint sound of water lapping against metal, like the echo of that rusted boat, still shifting in the current. He leaned back against his pack, watching the fire fade to embers. He thought of Clive's last note, the word north, and of the footprints along the shore. Someone else had been here, maybe searching for the same things, maybe guarding them. He didn't know yet what waited beyond the marsh, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The lake had spoken once, and he had answered. The rest of the truth, he suspected, was buried just ahead, like something heavy that refused to sink, no matter how long it had been under. He reached out, rested a hand on Ray's shoulder, and said quietly, "Tomorrow, we finish this." The dog's tail thumped once against the ground, steady and sure. The forest breathed around them, cold and endless, and the stars above burned faintly through the haze like distant fires refusing to die. Morning came gray and cold, a thin light bleeding through the trees. David woke to the smell of damp ash and pine, his fire long dead, the embers buried under a layer of frost. Ray was already awake, sitting upright and listening, her ears twitching at sounds he couldn't yet hear. For a moment he simply stayed still, feeling the stiffness in his back, the weight of the pack beside him, the steady pulse of his heart that reminded him he was still here, still breathing. The forest was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere nearby, the truth he had avoided for 10 years was waiting. He could almost feel it in the air, that strange, invisible current that told him this place remembered. He packed slowly, taking time to check the map he had drawn from memory the night before. The northern ridge curved down into a flat valley once used as a service route for supply trucks, long abandoned when the park had cut funding. The depot would be there, if it still stood. The journal had mentioned it only once, a vague note from Clive about offloading barrels, but now that single line had become an anchor in his mind. He slipped the map into his pocket, tightened his pack, and glanced down at Ray. "Let's see what's left," he murmured. The dog rose immediately, silent and sure-footed, and together they began descending toward the marshland. The ground grew soft underfoot, the soil dark and heavy. The smell hit him first, a sour, chemical bite that caught at the back of his throat. It wasn't the natural scent of decay or swamp gas. It was sharper, manufactured, something that had no right to exist in this kind of silence. Reeds leaned over the path, their tips blackened. The water pooled in shallow depressions glimmered with rainbow sheens that shifted as he passed. He crouched once, pressing his glove into the mud, and when he lifted it, the residue was slick and greasy. It left a faint burn on his skin when he wiped it away. Whatever had been dumped here, it had not been an accident. The realization hardened inside him like ice. He found the depot an hour later, half hidden behind a wall of willows. The structure was larger than he expected, a rusted hangar built from corrugated steel. Its roof collapsed in the center. The doors hung crookedly from their hinges, one of them jammed into the mud. He hesitated at the entrance, the smell stronger now, and pushed it open with the butt of his rifle. Inside, the dim light revealed rows of metal drums stacked along the far wall, most of them corroded, some split open at the seams. Dark streaks trailed down the floor, where something had leaked and dried long ago. The stench of oil and decay filled the air. Ray whined softly, keeping close to his leg. He moved slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The walls bore signs of age, water stains, bullet holes, graffiti scrawled in faded paint. He found a broken table near the center of the room, its surface covered with old papers and rusted tools. One folder, soaked through but intact, bore the same government insignia he had seen on the boat's box. He flipped it open. The pages inside were brittle, the ink blurred but readable. They were manifests, lists of cargo, delivery routes, signatures. He scanned down the columns until he found what he feared. Hazardous waste storage, temporary containment, Mason District. The date matched the week of the storm. He read another sheet, an internal memo addressed to his former supervisor, a man who had retired just months after Clive's death. The note ordered an immediate halt to all unauthorized inquiries into disposal practices and warned of disciplinary action for breach of confidentiality. At the bottom, in a different handwriting, was a small line, scrawled hastily. Problem resolved. Unit 7 inactive. David felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Unit 7. That had been their patrol number. He stood motionless, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. All those years he had told himself it had been the weather, an unpredictable storm, a terrible misstep. But Clive had died because someone decided the truth was inconvenient. His partner's last report, the strange smells, the trucks at night. They hadn't been coincidences. The lake had been poisoned, and the men responsible had buried their guilt under government paper and silence. He turned toward the back of the hangar. A metal locker stood there, half buried under debris. It took several minutes to pry it open. Inside was a small, sealed container, still clean despite the rust surrounding it. The label read, Specimens, Environmental Samples, North Basin. He cracked the seal carefully. Inside were several small vials filled with murky water, each tagged with dates. The water had turned opaque, tinged with the same metallic hue as the lake. Even through the glass, it smelled faintly of rot. There was no doubt now. They had used the lake as a dumping site. The sound came then, faint but distinct, the crunch of gravel outside. Ray lifted her head, ears up, a low growl rising in her throat. David killed his flashlight and moved to the wall, pressing himself against the cool metal. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. He could make out the faint outline of a figure in the doorway, broad shoulders, a flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. The man stepped inside, unaware he wasn't alone. The beam passed over the rusted drums, the papers, and then toward the back of the hangar where David stood. "Never thought you'd come back here," the man said finally. His voice was rough, older now, but unmistakable. "You always did have a hard time letting things lie." The light found his face, gray stubble, deep lines, eyes that had seen too much and learned to stop caring. It was Harlan, his old district chief, the man who had signed off on the investigation's closure. 10 years ago, Harlan had shaken his hand at the memorial and told him to move on. Now he looked like a ghost in uniform. David stepped forward slowly, lowering his rifle. "You knew," he said, his voice low. "You knew what happened out here." Harlan exhaled, the breath long and tired. "We did what we were told. That's how things work, son. You think you're going to fix it all now? It's done. It's over." "Clive's dead because of this," David said. "Because you covered it up." Harlan's gaze didn't waver. "Clive got curious. Too curious. You know what happens when people start asking questions in the wrong direction." He took a step closer. "You got out clean. Leave it that way." The words hung between them, heavy and cold. David felt the anger rise, sharp and bitter. But he didn't move. He could see, behind the man's defiance, the weariness that came from years of silence. There would be no justice here, not the kind he had once believed in. Only acknowledgement or denial. "I'm not leaving it buried," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Harlan's eyes softened for just a moment. "Then you're a fool," he said. He turned and walked back toward the door, his boots scraping against the concrete. When the sound of his footsteps faded, the hangar was still again. David stood there for a long time. The air felt heavier, the smell of rust thicker. He looked down at the folder in his hand, the proof of everything they had hidden. There was no satisfaction in it, only the dull ache of knowing he had been right too late. Ray nudged his leg softly, as if to remind him there was still something left to do. He nodded once, then began gathering what evidence he could. The documents, the samples, the photo. He packed them carefully into his bag and stepped out into the open air. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow. The sky was low and colorless, the light fading fast. He followed the path back through the marsh until the trees opened onto the shore of Mason Lake. The water was calm again, though darker now, reflecting nothing. The raft he had built was gone, broken apart by the wind or the current. The old boat still lay where he had found it, half submerged, waiting. He set his pack down on the ground and knelt beside the water. For a long while he didn't move. The lake had become something else entirely, not just a place of memory, but a witness. He thought of Clive's handwriting, the last message written in haste, the photo of them smiling by the same boat. Everything led here, to this quiet stretch of poisoned water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ranger's badge, tarnished, the lettering worn away. It had been a symbol once, of duty and purpose. Now it was only weight. He stood, took the badge in one hand, and walked slowly into the water until it reached his knees. The cold bit into him, sharp and clean. He looked out across the lake's surface, the faint ripple of movement where the boat leaned. "You deserved better," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Clive or to himself. Then he let the badge go. It sank slowly, vanishing into the dark. When he returned to shore, Ray was waiting. He sat beside her, the wind cutting through his wet clothes, the sky beginning to flurry with snow. The forest around him seemed to breathe again, not in peace, but in release. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the call of geese, faint but real, echoing across the valley. The sound stirred something deep inside him, a reminder that life, even poisoned, found a way to return. He built a small fire from driftwood and sat until night fell. The flames danced weakly against the cold air, their reflections flickering on the lake. The documents lay in his pack beside him, safe for now. In the morning, he would carry them out of the forest. There were people who could still listen, even after all this time. Whether justice came or not didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that silence would no longer be the only story. As the snow thickened, he lay back against his pack, Ray curling beside him. The warmth of her body seeped through the layers of his coat. He watched the sky darken until only a few stars broke through the clouds. His eyelids grew heavy, but he fought the pull of sleep long enough to look once more toward the lake. The boat was still there, half buried in water and shadow, but it no longer looked menacing. It looked lighter somehow, as if the years had begun to lift from it. When morning came, the storm had passed. The lake was frozen near the edges, a thin crust of ice forming where the waves met the shore. David packed his things and took one last look at the water. Ray barked softly, urging him to move on. He smiled faintly, the first true smile in years, and turned toward the trail. His boots crunched through the frost, the sound steady and clean. Behind him, the lake lay silent under its thin veil of ice. The wind carried snow across its surface, covering the scars, softening the shapes. The world would forget in time, as it always did. But somewhere beneath that frozen mirror, the badge rested beside the old boat. And the truth, at last, no longer needed to hide. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more real-life inspired tales. Watch the next video, and don't forget to share this one with your friends.